Hello and welcome to Conservation Biology. This lecture we're going to look at the history of conservation biology with a particular view coming from the United States. The Enlightenment occurred during largely the mid-19th century, and we're going to look at that time before that, the Pre-Enlightenment. There were no environmental ethics per se. People were living in an agricultural community, so they didn't live in cities, although cities were growing. And during this time, most people relied on a knowledge of nature to get by. So they had to know what foods were edible, when to plant, when to pick, what plants served as sources of medicine, and of course what plants were dangerous and what animals were dangerous, and perhaps their behaviors. The Enlightenment occurred during the 18th and 19th centuries, and it was this philosophy that largely rejected religious texts and instead studied nature as a source of revelation. The theists believe that a divine entity such as God was directly involved in human affairs, where deists, that movement was growing, that philosophical movement was growing during the Enlightenment, and deism proposes that the world was created by a divine entity, but does not interfere with the goings-ons of man or nature. And we saw this sort of thing in the writings of Thomas Jefferson, and we see science take up deism. And in fact, during this time is when we see the rise of things like laws, Boyle's law, Newton's laws. These laws were thought to be divinely produced and set forth. We saw a growing interest in how nature works, and part of this had to do also with global exploration. So people were going around the world, such as Darwin, and making discoveries for science. Cities are continuing to grow, and most of the time during the Enlightenment, most people were agrarian, although you see a larger proportion of people living in cities. And we start to see a bit of an environmental ethic emerging at this time. So if we look at the Industrial Revolution, which kicked in about 1820 with the development of the steam engine driven by fossil fuels, we start to see quickly growing cities. So what you had was the creation of large factories, and they had to be peopled. And so a number of people were moving into cities. With the formation of factories, we saw this attitude that nature was simply a place where we could pollute. And this was just a byproduct of human progress. Largely a movement in Germany, the Romantic-Transcendental preservation ethic, yes, that's a mouthful, arose that sort of looked at cities as being artificial, and man's natural state was in the woods, in the forest, in the mountains, and along the streams. And wild places were good for the soul. In the U.S., we saw this in the writings of John Muir out west, Thoreau and Emerson in the East Coast. And it's important to note that the president at the time was Teddy Roosevelt when this was happening. The next ethic to come about was the resource conservation ethic. And this is another ethic kind of born out of Germany. And the central player for the resource conservation ethic is Gifford Pinchot, who was the first U.S. trained forester and was the first head of the U.S. Forest Service. He was trained in Germany, came back, and promoted this resource conservation ethic where large-scale industrial deforestation was sort of frowned upon, and instead forests should be seen as a sustainable resource. And his view is that natural land should benefit the most people for the longest time. And also the concept of multiple use forests. So forests just don't provide wood, it's a place for recreation and nature watching. And this is a little bit different from the preservationist view, which looked at forests as a place where there should be no human intervention. The resource conservation ethic believed that there should be use of forests, just sustainable use. So Gifford Pinchot was from a New York family, but they spent their summers in New Milford, PA, and their estate was called Great Towers. This is open to the public, and it's a fantastic site, very interesting to explore. And on that property, there was a very large forest. The Yale School of Forestry set up their summer practicum, the School of Forestry, and sent their, at the time, young men there to learn to be foresters. One of those students that was trained in New Milford was Aldo Leopold, and in his experiences out west, he saw the degradation of forest lands due to overpopulation of deer, because forests in certain areas were managed for maximizing the number of deer. And that led him to come up with something we now call the Evolutionary-Ecological land ethic. And he outlines his thoughts in the Sand County Almanac, and most succinctly in a chapter called the Land Ethic, where the ecosystem and ecosystem processes as a whole should be kept intact as much as possible. Aldo Leopold went on to become the first chair of a wildlife department. We still see these different schools of philosophy, environmental ethics existing. The Romantic-Transcendental preservation ethic, we still see manifested in wilderness areas and scenic rivers. The resource conservation ethic is still seen in how we manage U.S. forest lands. And the Evolutionary-Ecological land ethic of Aldo Leopold is still seen in wildlife management areas. So it's not that one ethic replaced another, it's just that others came on board to complement each other. So since 1940 and Aldo Leopold, there was a boom in conservation ethics across the general population that occurred in the 1960s and 70s. And we saw things such as the first Earth Day, and a number of legislative actions were passed, including the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act. And the new environmental ethic was made more popular by Rachel Carson in a publication, Silent Spring, which criticized the overuse of insecticides and pesticides. And nowadays, conservation biology is mainstream. It's a mainstream science. There's several journals, Journal of Conservation Biology, Journal of Biological Conservation, and then several journals more focused on taxonomy or habitats.